Hi, I'm Dave Fiedler, and I work for the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality's Environmental Assistance Program. We take pride in helping small businesses identify what state and federal environmental regulations pertain to their operations and what they need to do to comply. Today I'm going to talk about a new federal regulation that affects businesses that spray paint metal and plastic parts. This rule goes by the name of the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants, or NESHAP for short. For those familiar with the Federal Register, this rule can be found under Title 40, Part 63, Subpart HHH. Now, after a brief introduction about the NESHAP, I will explain who needs to comply, what they need to do, and when it needs to be completed. I will conclude with some additional resources that you may find helpful in complying with this NESHAP rule. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the training. I'll be back at the end of the video with some final remarks. Let's begin with some background information about the NESHAPs. It is a federal rule, not a state rule, thus compliance is nationwide. The EPA has identified 30 hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs, that are prevalent in urban areas and are responsible for adverse health effects on people living in highly populated areas. Over the past 15 years, EPA has been promulgating NESHAP rules to limit the emissions of these dirty 30 HAPs. The coaters of miscellaneous metal and plastic parts is not the only business sector impacted by a NESHAP regulation. There's a NESHAP for gas stations. This NESHAP requires that the vapors being displaced from the underground storage tanks flow back into the tanker, dropping the load, as opposed to traveling out the vent pipes. The vapors in the truck are then captured back at the terminal where the tankers are loaded. It's a closed-loop system that greatly reduces the discharge of gasoline vapors, which contain 9 different hazardous air pollutants, including benzene, into the air. EPA has promulgated a NESHAP that affects your neighborhood dry cleaners. The NESHAP requires the reduction in the perchloroethylene emissions through the use of state-of-the-art dry cleaning machines. Although these machines are costly, the amount of money saved in solvent purchases each year provides for a rather quick payback. The NESHAP for paint stripping and miscellaneous surface coating focuses on reducing the emissions of metals found in the coatings used for motor vehicles, mobile equipment, and miscellaneous metal and plastic parts. Another goal of the rule is to minimize the evaporative emissions of methylene chloride found in paint strippers. Now, this NESHAP does not restrict the VOC content of the coatings, although we strongly urge you to investigate and hopefully switch over to water-based technologies. This training video will focus on the surface coating of miscellaneous metal and plastic parts. I will not be discussing the surface coating of motor vehicles and mobile equipment or the paint stripping portions of the NESHAP. However, I will point out a website that contains information about these activities at the end of the video. Who is subject to the NESHAP? The simple answer to this question is facilities that are an area source that spray-apply coatings on metal and/or plastic parts. Now I need to define those bolded terms: area source, spray applies, coatings, and parts. This NESHAP applies to coating operations that use relatively small quantities of coatings. To be subject to the NESHAP, your facility has to fall under the definition of an area source. Area source means your facility's potential to emit individual hazardous air pollutants from all of your sources of air pollution is less than 10 tons per year, and its potential to emit all hazardous air pollutants is less than 25 tons per year. If you exceed these thresholds, your facility is considered a major source of HAPs and is not subject to this particular NESHAP regulation. Now, making these emission calculations can be very complicated. It requires you to review your MSDS sheets of the raw materials that go into your processes and making assumptions that your processes are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, unless limited by conditions found in your state air permits. Now, I suggest you contact our Environmental Assistance Program if you are not sure whether your facility is an area source. As you can see in this simple example, ABC Company's potential to emit individual hazardous air pollutants is less than 10 tons, and their combined HAP emissions is less than 25 tons. So therefore, ABC Company is an area source. Now, spray apply means that coatings are applied using a handheld spray gun that atomizes the coating. The rule identifies some applications that are not included in this definition. For example, if your business only uses paint guns with a paint cup capacity equal to or less than 3 fluid ounces, you are not subject to the NESHAP. Some additional coating methods that do not fall under this definition or this NESHAP regulation are listed on the slide. To meet the definition of coating and in turn be subject to the NESHAP, your coatings have to contain at least one of the 5 targeted hazardous air pollutants, and they are cadmium, chromium, lead, manganese, and nickel. Containing is a key word. If your coatings contain 0.1% or more by mass of cadmium, hexavalent chrome, lead, or nickel, or 1% or more by mass of manganese or non-hexavalent chromium, you are subject to the NESHAP. If your paint supplier cannot guarantee your coatings will be HAP-free, then you should comply with the NESHAP regulation. Now, the rule does not contain an exhaustive list of what types of parts are covered under the rule. It just provides some examples. The rule applies to just about any type of metal, plastic, or combination of metal and plastic parts or products. Let's summarize who is subject to the rule. To be subject, your facility or business's potential to emit hazardous air pollutants must be less than 10 tons per year for individual HAPs and less than 25 tons per year for combined HAPs. The rule only applies to handheld spray guns with a paint cup capacity of more than 3 fluid ounces. The coatings you use must contain one or more of the 5 metal hazardous air pollutants: cadmium, chromium, lead, manganese, and nickel. The NESHAP applies to any part that is metal, plastic, or a combination of the two. Finally, the NESHAP does exempt certain coating activities from the requirements of the rule. If you think you meet one of these exemptions, you may want to read Section 63.11169, Paragraph D of the NESHAP. Now that we've answered who is subject to the NESHAP, let's get into the heart of the NESHAP, and that is, what are you required to do? Now, we've broken this up into general and paperwork requirements. Under the general requirements, we'll talk about enclosures and paint filters, type and cleaning of the spray paint application equipment, and training. Under paperwork requirements, there are notifications, certifications, and record keeping. The NESHAP requires that all coating of parts be done inside a spray paint booth or preparation station. The enclosure must have a fixed roof, at least 3 complete walls or curtains, and ventilated such that air is drawn into the enclosure. Openings in the wall or roof are allowed for conveyors and parts to pass through the enclosure. Each booth or prep station must be fitted or equipped with either a water wash system or a filter system to control the overspray. If using water wash spray paint booths, you need to comply with the manufacturer's specifications. If using filters to control the overspray, they must achieve a 98% capture of the overspray. Now, ASHRAE Method 52.1 and some additional parameters contained in the NESHAP must be followed to measure the filter efficiency. You do not have to conduct this test as long as you have a product bulletin from the manufacturer of your filters that specifically states that the filters were tested in accordance with Method 52.1 and the NESHAP. As a reminder, the filters must be changed out before breakthrough of the paint solids occur. It's recommended that you have a manometer or similar type of pressure drop gauge to measure the resistance to the airflow across the filters, so you'll know when to make that filter change. Again, look for the ASHRAE Method 52.1 test method on your product bulletin. The NESHAP requires that all of the coatings being applied must be done through using high-volume, low-pressure spray guns, electrostatic, air-assisted airless, or some equivalent technology. If your coating line consists of robotic spray equipment, it will not be subject to the NESHAP because it does not fall under the definition of spray apply. And again, spray apply means using handheld spray paint guns. Now, the rule does not allow for the atomization or spraying of cleaning solvent into a booth. The alternative options recommended under the NESHAP are the use of gun washers or manually cleaning the disassembled parts of a gun with solvent. If manually cleaning the guns, make sure the dirty solvent and the rags are collected and disposed of as a hazardous waste. All of your employees that will be painting need to be trained. The training must consist of hands-on instruction and classroom instruction. This slide identifies what the curriculum must consist of. The rule does not require you to have a third party do the training. You can do it yourself, but again, you must have documentation of the curriculum and when and who participated in the training. If you want to use a third party to do the training, contact your trade association, industry consultant, or paint or equipment supplier about the training they may be offering. For more information about training, I suggest you read Section 63.11173, Paragraph F of the NESHAP. Now, the EPA requires you to submit to them paperwork. There's an initial notification form that you need to fill out that simply identifies who you are and that you are subject to the NESHAP regulation. Once you are required to be operating in compliance with the rule, you will need to provide EPA certification of your compliance. The Environmental Assistance Program developed a form you can use to comply with both the initial notification and compliance certification requirements. You don't have to use our form. We developed this form to save you some time. It should only take you a few minutes to complete. The NESHAP requires you to keep records of all of the following information. You need to keep track of who was trained, when it occurred, and who did the training, and what the curriculum consisted of. You need to keep copies of the product bulletin identifying that your booth filters are 98% efficient according to ASHRAE Method 52.1. You need to keep copies of the notification and certification forms that you mail in to EPA. If you stop complying with any part of this rule, you will need to identify when the deviation occurred and what corrective actions were taken to get back into compliance as quickly as possible. Before I can explain when you need to comply with the requirements, you need to know whether your facility is considered an existing source or a new source. Now, existing sources have more time to comply with the rule than new sources. An existing source is one that was painting or coating parts on or before the date this NESHAP rule was proposed in the Federal Register, which was September 17, 2007. It also allows those facilities that were in the process of installing surface coating equipment when the rule was proposed to fall under the definition of existing. EPA did not want to penalize a company that had committed resources to a coating operation prior to the proposed rule. The definition of a new source, then, is the converse of the definition of an existing source. To be considered new, the facility was not engaged in coating parts prior to September 17, 2007, and the coating equipment installation occurred sometime after September 17, 2007. Now let's discuss when you need to comply with all of the requirements I have just reviewed. Your compliance date, again, depends on whether your facility fits the definition of an existing source or a new source. For existing sources, your first deadline is January 11, 2010. That's the deadline for submittal of your initial notification form. Then you have until January 10th of 2011 to be in compliance with the enclosures, spray guns, training, and record-keeping requirements. 3 months after that, you need to send in your certification of compliance to EPA. For new sources, you are supposed to be in compliance with the enclosure requirements, spray guns, and record keeping by January of 2008 or upon startup, whichever is later. The notification, certification, and training deadline was July 2008 or 180 days after startup, whichever is later. So let's do a quick recap of what I just went over. The federal NESHAP for paint stripping and miscellaneous surface coating affects businesses that spray paint metal and plastic parts. The major exceptions to the rule is if all of your coatings do not contain the 5 HAP metals or your spray guns have a cup size of 3 ounces or less. If you are an existing source, then this coming January, you will need to submit your initial notification form. By 2011, you will need to conduct painting in your booths or preparation stations that are controlled by water wash or filters that are at least 98% efficient in removing overspray. The HVLP or equivalent transfer efficiency guns are required, and those guns cannot be cleaned by atomizing solvent. The rule also requires the operators that do the painting receive training initially and every 5 years after that. And by March of 2011, you need to submit a document stating your compliance with the rule. If you are a new source, then you should already be in compliance with the requirements. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a website dedicated to this NESHAP regulation. To get to that website, you first have to start off at the DEQ homepage. And that's www.michigan.gov/DEQ. We get to the homepage. The next thing you want to do is click on Air. Underneath Air, you want to click on Clean Air Assistance. And this will bring up a web page containing lots of information on air quality regulations. You need to scroll down to Federal Regulations, and underneath this title, you'll see a link to paint stripping and miscellaneous surface coating operations at area sources. Click on that, and that will bring you up to our web page that's dedicated to the NESHAP regulation. I want to point out a few important documents on this web page. I mentioned if you're using methylene chloride paint strippers, you'll want to read this fact sheet pertaining to the requirements you need to comply with under the paint stripping portion of the NESHAP. There's also a fact sheet that you can read that gives a detailed explanation of the NESHAP as it pertains to miscellaneous metal and plastic parts coaters, as well as a fact sheet that pertains to the automotive collision shops who are also affected under this NESHAP regulation. Here's the link for the initial notification and compliance certification form that you can use to comply with those paperwork requirements. And finally, here is a link to the actual federal regulation as found in the Federal Register. I mentioned a few paragraphs that you may want to read in the rule, and this is where you would go to obtain that rule. Again, I think all of these documents will be very helpful in getting you in compliance with this NESHAP regulation. At a time when small business is challenged with economic uncertainties and economic growth is critical, access to environmental compliance assistance is essential to improve bottom-line performance. We hope that videos such as this one serve as an effective learning tool for you. I look forward to receiving your comments, feedback, and questions. My phone number and email will appear on the screen. So thank you for taking the time out to watch the video and for protecting Michigan's valuable natural resources.